Today we're going to, I don't know if you remember, but during our three-part section on the faith of Abraham, we actually skipped these 4 verses. They're right in the middle of Abraham's story in Hebrews, because it's kind of a parenthetical statement that is more general and applies really to everybody in chapter 11. And so I decided I would finish Abraham and then come back to this little section because it is more general. And it is, again, it's about really everybody that he mentions in chapter 11. But what we're going to see is that it's also kind of an encouragement for us to have those same attitudes about faith. So it's like in the middle of his story, he's going to have a little mini sermon about how we should live our lives in such a way that somebody could come back and say, by faith, Elaine, by faith, Kim or whoever, to have by faith said about us, about our lives. So that's kind of what this is about. And he does this in the, talking about this heavenly country that they had their eyes on. And so, verse 13, he sort of generically talks about these lives of faith. He says, all these people were still living by faith when they died. So up until this verse, he has talked about specific lives. Up through this verse, we talked about Abel, Enoch, Noah, and then Abraham. But what he's doing now in these verses is sort of summarizing the common principles of faith that everybody in this chapter that he's going to talk about. Everybody from Isaac, who's kind of next on the list after Abraham, all the way through the prophets, looking at how faith is exhibited in all of them. So each section talks about a particular man or woman. What these principles do is reveal how faith worked in their life specifically, but they represent common characteristics and perspectives and attitudes they all share, and they're things that we should emulate. Because again, that's the whole purpose of the author of Hebrews bringing up all of these lives, is so that we can learn from them, so that we can emulate them, so that we can see this is how what their perspective was, what they looked at in their lives, what was important to them. So that means that should be the way we look at these same things. So it's encouragement for each one of us. So he says all these people were still living by faith when they died. If you look at the way that verse is in the original Greek, it actually says they in faith died, is literally what he wrote. In faith died. So the NIV kind of expands that to say that they were living by faith when they died. And that's essentially correct. The idea is that all the way up until the point that they died, they were living by faith. But I think the author maybe could have even spelled it out that way if he wanted to. And when he says literally in faith died, I think that what he's saying is that they even approach death the same way that they approach life, trusting God and believing in Him, and that is they didn't fear death. And another thing is that they did not, and I think this is an important part of why he mentions it specifically this way, is that they did not see death as cheating them out of anything that God promised them. In other words, the fact that they died before all of these promises were fulfilled, they did not believe that God had cheated them or lied to them or not fulfilled His promises. That they were not lacking anything that God had in store for them at the point that they died. Faith, I think, is not only as vital, but maybe even more vital when we're thinking about death. Death is a veil that you and I cannot see through. So the only thing we can do is trust the one who passed through it before us and on our behalf. And so the reason I say this is if you go on the next sentence in this, verse 13, they did not receive the things promised, they only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. And I think that's where that important principle comes in, that they did not see death as cheating them out of what God promised them. Because when these people that he mentions died, they did not know the complete fulfillment of all the things that God had promised them at that time. Abraham was probably the best example of this, and maybe that's why he brought this up in the middle of Abraham's story. Because while Abraham certainly knew some things, he saw Isaac born, most of what God promised Abraham he never saw in his life. He didn't see the nation formed. He didn't see the kingdom. He didn't see the multitudes that would come out of, that would be his descendants, so much that they would be like the stars of the sky. He certainly didn't see the Messiah. Most of what God promised Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, he never saw. He only saw a piece of it. And yet, he lived by faith, and he faced his own death by faith. In faith, he died. That is, he died still believing God, even though he had not seen most of it. He only saw it, he says, from a great distance. And when I read this, I think that they saw the promises of God as a destination and not necessarily as the place they were in at the moment. What God promised to them was where they were going, where they were going to end up. God had described these as a destination for them. And I think that's interesting because we should see our Christian lives as a journey that we're on. When we get saved, the place we're in at that moment is not where God wants us. It's where God found us. But that's not where God wants to keep us. It's a journey. And there's a destination. And of course, that ultimate destination is the presence of God. That ultimate destination is heaven. But in this life, we're never going to see it all. Just like Abraham, we may see pieces of it. We may see stones along the path. But we're never going to see that final destination. And so when we think about when the end of our life comes, we need to realize that even though not every promise has been necessarily manifested in our everyday life, that doesn't mean that God failed us. It just means, like Abraham, much of what he promised is going to be for later generations. We're only maybe one piece of the puzzle. And in our own lives, ultimately, that ultimate promise is the presence of God, in heaven. So they saw these promises from afar off, and they welcomed them. Now, there's one other word in here that's not in the NIV, and it's the word that translates persuaded. And so what he's saying is they saw them and were persuaded and welcomed them. So the NIV leaves out that word. And it means to convince someone by argument. And so what he's describing here is the reason that they could accept these things they were seeing far off, these things that they might not actually manifest in their daily lives. They were persuaded by God because God had convinced them that his promises are true. God had proven himself to them. God had showed himself trustworthy. God had never lied to them. God had never failed them. So therefore, they could trust God. So they were persuaded, and therefore they embraced those promises. The word welcome means literally to grab something with your arms and embrace it. So that means these people that he's listed here in Hebrews chapter 11, they were, when the promises when God called them to these things and made these promises, instead of running away from them or being intimidated by them or being afraid to go where God wanted them to go, they embraced what God had in store for them. Now that sounds easy in retrospect, but when you think about what God had told Abraham to do, what did God tell Abraham to do? Remember? Get up out of your comfortable life.
Go somewhere.
The only place you'd ever known.
Yeah.
Go somewhere
you
else.
don't know where it is.
You don't know where it is. In a place where your enemies live and control.
And he never made it there.
And go there, and I promise I'm going to give it to you. Well, that's a promise of God, but that's a promise I'm not sure I want. If I'm a normal human being, I'm like, pass.
Yeah.
I'm happy where I am.
He was in his 70s when.
Yeah, exactly. So he was dealing with aches and pains.
I'm too old for
My
this.
knees hurting. And
Yeah.
My dad's favorite phrase, my aching back.
yeah, exactly. So that's what I mean by the fact that it's easy to look back on God's promises as a positive thing, but when you're on the other end of it, what God promises may sound fearful, may sound like something you're not sure you're interested in, may sound like a place you don't want to go. But it says here that they embrace them. And again, I think it's no accident that he has this little parenthetical section in the middle of Abraham's story, because that's, even though we kind of gave Abraham a hard time for some of the things he didn't exactly believe God for, you remember it did say the first step, God called him, he went. And that first step, he did. He embraced what God called him to do. Now, he had some issues later on, but in that first step, he did. He said, okay, and he went. So he embraced God's promise. So finally, they admitted that they were aliens and strangers on the earth. And I think this is how that we can internalize this, because when we see that our proper place in relation to this world versus the next world and our relationship to it, I think that helps us not try to hold on to the now, but embrace what God has in store instead. When we realize this is not our home. Okay. So they admitted that they were aliens and strangers. The word admitted, it's the word homologio, which means literally just to say the same thing. Sometimes it's translated in the Bible as confess. It means to say the same thing about something. So who are they agreeing with? Well, I think in this idea, it's kind of like agreeing with an idea. The idea that we're not home yet. We're agreeing with whatever it was that God was saying about their time here on earth versus their time in the future. So the two words that he uses there for aliens and strangers, aliens is the word xenos. You'll recognize that. We use that a lot of times for
xenophobia.
Xenophobia, being afraid of foreigners. It means literally a foreigner or an alien. So the idea is that we're believers in God. This earth is not where our citizenship lies. We are aliens. We've only got green cards. We're here on a work visa. But this is not our home. This is not our homeland. We're just here for a time and for a purpose, but eventually we're going home.
Amen.
And then the other word that I will not try to pronounce, but it's a compound word, and it means, part of it means near, the other part of it means to make yourself at home. And so the way it came to be used is an alien living alongside citizens. So it also sometimes is used to be sojourning in a strange place or away from one's own people. It's sometimes translated as a pilgrim. The idea is you're on a journey, but you're not home. And the people that are around you are not your family, or they're not your home, they're not your homeland people. I mean, you are the one who's a stranger. You are the one who's only passing through. You are on a pilgrimage. It's sometimes translated pilgrim. So you are not home. But the idea still is you are on a journey. You're going somewhere. So we're on our way home, but we're not home. And this is the perspective that they had. This is the whole point of him bringing this up. Now in verses 14 to 15 he says, people, and this is where he gets to the encouragement, I think, for us. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. So when he says people who say such things, that's why where he's trying to say you and I can have that same perspective. It doesn't have to be just Enoch and Abel and Abraham and and Isaac and David and all the others he's going to talk about. Anybody who has this perspective can be in this same category, which means we can do the same thing. We can say those things. Anybody, even those who are reading this, can have this perspective, and I think that's his point, that we should be emulating what they... this is not just a history lesson just to learn history. The purpose of it is so that we can learn to apply these same perspectives to our own lives. So people who say such things show they are looking for a country of their own. And so by calling ourselves aliens and strangers, what we're saying essentially is that what God has promised us is not here. Our citizenship isn't here. We're looking for another place. The word there translated country, it's the word patris. It means literally a fatherland, or your native town, your homeland, where you came from. And we're looking for that, which means we're searching for it. That's what it means. We're searching intensely. We're desiring to get there. We're longing to get to that home. So what the perspective is that we realize that what God has promised us is not of this world. And so what we seek is not here. Our home is not here. Our homeland is yet to be seen, and that's what's important to us. It's what drives us. He goes on to say in verse 15, if they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had the opportunity to return. So what does he mean by this? What he's saying is that if we keep our attention on the place that God called us out of, that creates the temptation to want to go back there. So when I read this, all I could think of was the Exodus Hebrews that came out of slavery, went into the desert, and you remember the only thing they could think of is how much nicer it was back in Egypt, because they had a place to live and they had plenty of food. Why do you bring us out here to starve? Or why do you bring us out in the desert to die of thirst where there's no water? They couldn't let go of where they came from, right? Instead of looking where they were going, the promised land, all they wanted to do was look back to where they came from. And of course, the author of Hebrews took us through all of that in the previous chapters. So, anytime God calls us on this journey, but we keep thinking back on where we came from, then there's always going to be that temptation to think it's easier where you came from. And the thing is in this world, that may in fact be true. Because the path of least resistance is not following God. It's not the easy path to follow God. It's actually easier to just stay back in Egypt, right? You may be in slavery, but at least you get fed. At least you got a place to sleep. You don't have freedom. You're not in your homeland. But at least you got food and water. And so the path that God calls us on, that takes us, through this world that is not our own, is not the easy path. So this is their perspective. the perspective of these men and women that he mentions in chapter 11 are that they were looking forward to where God was calling them to, not backward from where God called them out of. Because that way they're not tempted to go back to what God called them out of. So instead of longing to go back like the Exodus Hebrews, what are they longing for? Verse 16. Instead, there's that contrast, that contrast word, saying this is what the contrast is instead of looking back to where you came from. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. So this word, longing, it means to stretch out, and to reach for something and to long for it. A lot of times when you think of longings and cravings and desires, from a biblical perspective, it's always a negative thing, like you're longing for something that's a sin or something like that, but it can be a positive thing too. You can long for the right kind of things. You can desire the right kinds of things. And so what they were longing for was a better country, and that word better, which means stronger or nobler, it's the same word that is used repeatedly in Hebrews, that is translated better, that describes how some aspect of Christ is superior to the law. If you think way back when we first introducing the book of Hebrews, I told you one of the themes of Hebrews was better, that Christ is better than the law, that Christ is better than Moses, that Christ is better than all these different things. That a lot of Hebrews is comparing the superiority of Christ and how he's better than some aspect of the law. That's the same word that's used here, longing for a better country. Remember, he's talking about we're traveling through a country that is not our own. So we're longing for a country that is our own. It's a better country. He says here it's a heavenly one. And the word there that is translated heavenly means above the sky. And so literally outside our universe. Because, you think about the sky is infinite. And this word means above that. And so it's sometimes translated celestial, usually translated heavenly. Essentially, it means not of this universe, not of this realm. A completely different spiritual realm outside this universe. But the whole idea is that what we're longing for is not what we have here, not the struggles that we're in now, not the country that we're sojourning through now, not the place where we're aliens. What we're longing for is that place that is our home, and it is above the sky. It is not this world. It is another place. It's a heavenly place. It's the abode of God. And so he concludes this section with saying, therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. So essentially what he's saying there is that our faith removes shame from our lives. God has no shame, just like Jesus said, I now call you friends. God has taken away the thing that puts shame upon us because of our fallen nature. That's removed. And what does that? Well, our faith enables us to be cleansed from the penalty of our sin, and that's what removes the shame between God and man. And so now, he is proud to be our God. He is proud for us to be his children now. Because that sense of shame that divides God and man, sin, has been removed from us. And it is faith that energizes that. That happens not by obedience, that happens by faith. For he has prepared this city for us. So we are on this journey to this heavenly country, and we've already got reservations there. We've already got a place there. He's preparing this place for us now. And of course, this has to be a callback to Jesus' promise to his disciples in John chapter 14. You remember John? We spent a little time in John.
A little familiar.
Yeah.
5 years or so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And remember what Jesus promised in John 14. Yeah, I'm going, but why am I going? What am I doing?
To prepare a
To
place.
Prepare a place for us. I gotta go get it ready for you guys so it'll be ready when y'all get there. Well, this is a callback to that clearly. He has prepared a city for them. So yeah, we're longing for it. Yeah, we are not citizens here. We are aliens here. And what God has given us here, he may have given us many blessings here, and he has, just like with Abraham, he gave him a partially what he promised him, but most of what he promised Abraham, he was not going to see until, of course, he was in God's presence, and then he could know all of it in reality. Same with us. So, why then does the author of Hebrews give us this little parenthetical statement in the middle of talking about all of these individual people and their lives of faith? Well, I think it's very clear, especially when he talks about this not looking back part. The whole point of the first century Jewish Christians is that they were under that temptation, as you remember, to go back to the law, remember? That's what this whole book is about, not going back to the law. So the law, if you will, just like Paul told us in Ephesians, was the schoolmaster to bring us to Christ. The law had its purpose. It brought you to this point. Now you're at that point. You've accepted Christ. Don't look back. Don't look back. Go forward. Remember that what God has promised you is something that is in the future. It's something that, just like these guys he mentions in Hebrews 11, we see it from afar. We might know some of it, but most of it we won't know until we get to heaven. So don't look back, look forward like all of these men and women in Hebrews chapter 11. So that you look for and long for that country that is yet to come. And if you have that perspective, if that's your perspective, you're looking out on the horizon and you're looking at that city that's being prepared for us, and you look for that country that's our real homeland, then when we go through these struggles and trials and battles in the here and now, we won't be destroyed. We won't be dejected. We won't give up because the battle is hard. Because that's what he's trying to encourage them not to do, is don't give up. The battle's hard. The giants are there, the walled cities are there, the battle's hard. But this is not your home. Your home is that future land, that future country, that future city that the master builder is building for you now. So look there, keep that as your perspective, and then you won't lose faith, which is what he doesn't want us to do, and go back to what we came from. Because that's maybe the easy route. It may be the easy route, but it's the route of failure. It's not the route of faith. It's not the route of God's blessing. And it's not the route of God in being able to use us for his purposes. So, the desire by the author of Hebrews is that it could be said of us, just like Abraham and Noah, by faith we followed God. By faith we were pilgrims in this land, but we were searching for something that was the city that God had promised us. By faith we followed God. And in faith we will die. Still believing him to our last breath. Because God never fails us.